2 and verse 12. There was no way I was going to start this last week, given how much time I think it's probably going to take for us to deal with these 5 verses. And I think these 5 verses go together. Even though verse 12 begins with the word for, which means there's more coming based on what has just been said, there's a lot of fors in Paul's writings here, especially in the book of Romans. And so, but we want to think about verse 12. And then, now, I've got a New King James. All right. Now, if you're looking at a New King James, it has at the beginning of verse 13 a parenthesis, right? Anybody else looking at a New King James? Got a parenthesis at the beginning of verse 13? Do you have a parenthesis close at the end of verse 15? Okay. Okay, and that may be the case as well. The King James may have that parenthesis as well. Now, what that means is that when you're reading this text, you can read the text and skip the parentheses and maintain the unity of thought. All right? And so what I want to do is I want to read verse 12, then jump to verse 16 and explain to you a little bit about this parenthetical statement and where it's placed and what it means, okay? So if we're reading this in verse 12, beginning of verse 12, remember, I'm going to get to the end of verse 12 and immediately skip over the entire parenthetical statement and go to verse 16. And you'll see that it reads perfectly clear. For as many as have sinned without law will also perish without law. And as many who have sinned in the law will be judged by the law in the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. You see how fluid that is? There's no loss of continuity of thought. Now, when you read this and you read it in order and read the parenthetical statement in it, it gets confusing. Now, and let me do that. Let me read it and read the parentheses and go to verse 16. For as many as have sinned without law will also perish without law, and as many as have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but doers of the law will be justified. For when the Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law unto themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them in the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. Now I want you to see how much more confusing that is. And note also this. If you read it straight through like that, look at the end of verse 15. And I'm actually getting ahead of myself, but I just want to get these ideas in your mind as we move forward. The accusing or excusing at the end of verse 15, if you're reading it straight through, places the accusing or the excusing in the day of judgment, right? Their thoughts either accusing or excusing them in the day when God will judge the secrets of the hearts of men. But that's not when the accusing or excusing takes place. The accusing or excusing takes place during their lifetime prior to the judgment of God. You see what I'm saying? In other words, they're not accused or excused in the day of judgment. They're accused or excused during the course of their life. And so that's why the parenthetical statement needs to be lifted out there and read straight through from verse 12 to verse 16. And then the parenthetical can be read after verse 16 without any problems of continuity. All right? So now let's go explain. I just want to kind of explain how all that works. Now let's go back to the text, verse 12, and look at question number 7. For as many as have sinned without law will also perish without law, and as many as have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. Now, this is the first time that the word law appears in the book of Romans, but it will not be the last. It's the first of 78 appearances of this word in this book alone. 78 times Paul uses the word law in the book of Romans. Now, as we move forward through this book, we need to remember two things. One, in most cases where Paul uses the word law in Romans, he's talking about the Mosaic law. Number two, but not always. In other words, you should read it initially as if Paul's talking about the law of Moses, but then consider whether or not the context is saying or requiring it to be the law of Moses. All right? Most of the time the answer will be yes, but sometimes the answer will be no. All right? And so, but in this case, it's obvious that he's talking about the law of Moses. Because first of all, he's talking about Jews and Gentiles, right? There in verse number 10. He's talking about Jews and Gentiles, or Jews and Greeks in verse 9, Jews and Greeks in verse 10. And then he says, for as many, so now he's separating between Jews and Greeks, Jews and Gentiles. The Gentiles are those who do not have the law. The Jews are those who have the law. But Paul says this, whether or not you have the law, when you sin, you'll be lost. In other words, it doesn't matter if you have the law or don't have the law. When you sin, you're lost. Gentiles sin, they're lost. They don't have the law. Jews sin, they have the law, they're lost. I see you licking your lips, Tony. What are you going to say?
Well, you skipped verse 11, and that's really consequential here, because he said there's no
partiality with God. You're right. I should have went back and introduced that.
He's showing that Jews and Gentiles are the same.
Right, and he says the same in verse 6.
Yes.
And that's what we talked about last week in verses 6 through 11. That God starts with God's going to render to everyone according to his deeds, verse 6. And then there's no partiality with God, verse 11. And then in verses 7, 8, 9, and 10, he delineates between Jews and Gentiles and says, look, they're all lost. They're all lost because they've all sinned. And there's nothing to deliver them in their law system. All right? So then when he gets to verse 12, he's just simply continuing to affirm that whether or not a person has the law of Moses, they're going to be lost. The Gentiles are going to be lost. The Jews are going to be lost. Now, note. I want to note the bottom note at the very bottom of the page there. We've already talked about how the word law, generally speaking, is going to be the law of Moses, but not always. But note also this: sometimes the original text, which is the Greek text, will specify the law of Moses by using the preceding definite article, the. Sometimes the text will say, the law, but not every time. For example, in verse 12, for as many as have sinned without law, the definite article's not there. But in the context, we know for sure he's talking about the law of Moses because it's contrasted in the very next line with the Jews, and it's in the next line, in the law. And so sometimes the definite article is there and makes it clear. Sometimes it's not there, but the context tells us that just because it doesn't say the law doesn't mean that it's not the law of Moses. Now, I want to go ahead and turn the page. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, and there's some things I want to make mention of, because these things have happened to me in the last 2 weeks. All right? And I'm just going to leave it at that, and then I'm going to come back to it. Now note, continuing the thought, this is especially true in this specific text, for while the Gentiles were without law, they could not be without any law. So the law under consideration in this verse has to be the law of Moses. And we know that Gentiles could not be without any law, and here's why. Look at Romans 4:15. For where there is no law, there is no transgression. In other words, if there's not a law, you can't sin, right? Well, what did verse 12 say? They sinned without law. So it can't be that they sinned without any law. It means they sinned without the law of Moses. If there's no law, you can't sin. Because sin, now I'm going to jump to letter C. 1 John 3:4, skip to letter C. Whoever, what? Sins transgresses the law, for sin is a transgression of the law. Now, and let me just go ahead and get Romans 5 out of the way while we're there. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed where there is no law. So, let's think for a moment. On the one hand, I've already noted that sometimes the word law means the law of Moses, even though the definite article is not there. But in the case of 1 John 3 and verse 4, the law is in that text, and it's not talking about the law of Moses. I mean, why would John in the year 90 or so, because he wrote near the end of the first century, why would John still be writing about the law of Moses in the year 90? And the answer is he's not. And here's what I was telling you about that has happened to me in the last 2 weeks. I did a series of videos for House to House, and I put them on my Facebook page and my Instagram page about the Ten Commandments. And people came out of the woodwork trying to tell me that the Ten Commandments are still in effect. And one of the verses that they quoted was 1 John 3 and verse 4. The law. Sin's a transgression of the law. And everybody sinned, Romans 3:23, so therefore everybody has transgressed the Ten Commandments. That's the reasoning. But their problem is, everywhere they see the word law, they automatically think what? Ten Commandments. And that's not right. That's not right. Again, context has to determine if it's the law of Moses or if it's law, God's law in general. Now, let's go ahead and answer question D. Was there sin before the law of Moses? Sure. Could Gentiles sin after the law of Moses was given? All right. Is there sin in the world today, even though the law of Moses has been taken away? Yes. So that tells us a number of things. Number one, and this is what I said in one of my videos, was with the exception of the Sabbath, all the things in the Ten Commandments were sins before God gave the Ten Commandments. It's always been a sin to murder, right? In other words, we didn't need the Ten Commandments to know that it's wrong to murder. I mean, all we got to do is read Genesis chapter 4, right? All we got to do is read Cain and Abel. Because Cain obviously knew what he did was wrong, because Cain said, my punishment is greater than I can bear. In other words, there's no way I can atone for what I have done. I cannot bear the punishment for what I've done. And so Cain knew he had sinned. God all but just expressly told him that he had sinned. You have, let's see, think about another. Was it wrong to lie before the Ten Commandments came around? Well, sure it was wrong to lie. Was it wrong to commit adultery before the Ten Commandments? Was it wrong to covet? Was it wrong to practice idolatry? I mean, all of these, all of these things were wrong before the Ten Commandments came around. And so in other words, we didn't need the Ten Commandments to tell us that these things are wrong. And now that the Ten Commandments have been taken away, all of these things are still wrong, aren't they? Still wrong to murder, still wrong to commit adultery, still wrong to covet, still wrong to bear false witness. I mean, still wrong to practice idolatry. All those things are still wrong. They were wrong before the Ten Commandments. They were wrong during the period of the Ten Commandments, and they're wrong today. And they were wrong for the Gentiles during the period of the Ten Commandments, because the Ten Commandments weren't given to the Gentiles. And so that's a common mistake that and I don't even know what to call them. They're not necessarily Sabbatarians, because there are a lot of people who are not Sabbatarians who still think we need to follow the Ten Commandments today. I wouldn't know how to. I don't. I don't know what moniker to hang on them. I guess we could call them commandment keepers or whatever.
I think most people just get confused with the Jew and the Greek, who the law was given to. I believe that's the biggest part of that problem.
If we could get people to see, that even if they were alive then, the Ten Commandments wouldn't have been for them. And the Bible is so clear on that. So clear. I mean, Moses just came right out and said it in Deuteronomy chapter 5. God did not make this covenant with our fathers, with those before. He didn't make it with the nations round about. He said, even with us, those of us who are alive here this day. Moses is clear who, and by the way, that Deuteronomy 5 and that statement in the first 5 verses of Deuteronomy 5 is the introduction to the retelling of the Ten Commandments. But you're exactly right. If we could just get people to understand who the Ten Commandments were given to and who was obligated to obey them, it would clear up a lot of problems.
Cornelius was a just and righteous man. Obviously, he wasn't Jewish. There's no hint of him being a proselyte or anything like that.
That's exactly right.
But he had been living in a way that was in favor of God. In some way, you don't know exactly what law he was given, but Cornelius had his law, whatever it was.
Whatever it was. Now, what you've done for me, Kyle, is you've given me my segue into what Moses Lord said on this section of Scripture. And I never thought about this before, but it's absolutely right. Lord, this is on page 83 of Lord's commentary on Romans. He says, well, let me just read it. On verse 12, it says, those that are sinned without law will perish without law. It says, they shall be lost without being condemned by the terms of direct revelation such as the Jews had. In other words, they're still going to be lost even though they don't have a written law like the Jews have. Now here's the key part. He says, the measure of light that they have, be it much or little, is their rule of life, and by it they will stand or fall. In other words, however much revelation they have is what they'll be judged by. Now, Paul goes into that level of light in verses 13 through 15 in that parenthetical statement. The law is written in their hearts. And it becomes a law unto itself. And their own law of the heart and their own conscience either accuses them or excuses them. All right? But note this is, but here we need to guard a point or two. In every condition of life in which men are lost, they can also be saved. See, Paul's statement here about those that sinned without the law are lost, and those who sinned with the law will also be lost. Lord makes this point. But it's not only about being lost, it's also about being saved. In other words, whatever law God gave to those people, Gentile or Jew, whatever law he gave to them was not designed to condemn them. It was designed to save them. And so if a Gentile can be lost without the law of Moses, he can also be what? He can be saved without the law of Moses. And that's what Kyle was mentioning here with Cornelius. Cornelius was a Gentile. He didn't have the law of Moses. But it seems obvious to everybody who's ever read Acts chapter 10 that Cornelius was a good man. He was a man who God heard his prayers, right? And he didn't have the law of Moses. And so if a guy could be lost outside of the law of Moses, he could also be saved outside of the law of Moses. If a man could be lost in the law of Moses, he could also be saved in the law of Moses. But what Paul's going to eventually get to in chapter 3 is that everybody that's going to be saved without the law or with the law is going to be saved by Jesus Christ. That's the point. That's what Paul's ultimately building up to. He's showing how everybody has broken whatever law system they have, whether it's the law of Moses or the law of the heart. They've all broken it. They've all broken it. Therefore, they're all lost. And their law system provides no method of atoning for their sins. Therefore, whether Gentile or Jew, everybody who's ever going to be saved will be saved by Jesus. Now, by the way, the book of Hebrews also teaches us this. In talking about the redemption of Christ, it says, for if the blood of goats and calves and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean sanctify the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works? In other words, the Hebrews writer is trying to tell people, even those who practice the law of Moses and offered animal sacrifices are still going to be saved by the blood of Christ. And in verse 15 of Hebrews 9, it says, he died for the sins of those who lived under the first covenant. So even people who lived under the law of Moses ultimately are going to be saved by Jesus. Abraham eventually going to be saved by Jesus. Noah going to be saved by Jesus. David, Saul, everybody who ever lived, Jew or Gentile, up till the time of Christ, will be saved by the blood of Jesus. And then, of course, everybody who's lived after that time that's going to be saved will be saved by the blood of Jesus. And that's what Paul's building up to. And I know it's difficult because we're taking this thing sections at a time, and it's going to take us a little while to get to Romans 3:25. All right? But, well, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God is verse 23. But verse 25 is the verse that tells it how you're going to be redeemed through the blood of Jesus Christ. And so Paul's building this case, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, up through verse 23, and then I won't say he springs Christ on them, but he reveals that Christ is going to save everybody. Not that Christ is going to save everybody, but that everybody who's going to be saved is going to be saved by Christ.
And he's going to go on through the rest of the book.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Once he's established all this, he's going to bring Christ into it, and then that's the premise the rest of the way out. All right. So I wanted to mention what Lard had said, because I thought it had never occurred to me to think that if a guy could be lost without the law of Moses, he could also be saved. I mean, I knew Gentiles could be saved, but I hadn't thought about it in this context. All right. So, but for the sake of continuity, let's go on to verse number 8, or not verse 8, question number 8, which is verse 13. It says, for not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified. Now, I think Paul is here talking to the Jews. I think he's talking to the Jews, in particular in this case, because who were the hearers of the law? In other words, in whose ears were the law in whose ears was the law read week after week? As Paul said, every Sabbath day. The Jews. They were the hearers of the law. But Paul says, you're not doers of the law. Not the hearers of the law will be justified, but the doers of the law will be justified. And we've already talked about the parenthetical statement. So let's go to the second paragraph under number 8, the second paragraph of notes. Paul here speaks directly to the Jews and of their faith or their boast in the law of Moses, that possession and knowledge of the law is of itself insufficient to save. In other words, just because you're a Jew and just because you possess the law and just because you hear the law being read in the synagogues or in the temple or wherever every Sabbath day is no guarantee of your justification. But that's what the Jews thought. We're in possession of the law of God. You know, we have the law of God. We read the law of God. We hear the law of God. But what Paul says is, you're not doing the law of God. No, all those things they're not sufficient. You got to do what the law says. And it says, this particular statement reminds me of James 1:22. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. You know, in James 1:25, whoso looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues therein. That's the man that's going to be saved. Not the man who just looks into it, but the man who looks into it and continues in it. And he also says later in that text, be doers of the work. If any man be a doer of the work, and not just the word, but of the work. All right. Now, I'm going to read this last paragraph, and we'll close right here. So, and this is me. All right, this is my statement. All right. I cannot help but think of how many times through the years unfaithful brethren or non-Christians with ties to the church hold up that proximity as some measure of faithfulness to God. I have dealt with too many brethren through the years who would never tolerate false doctrine to be taught and would raise a ruckus if such were ever to be the case. But they themselves are not diligently living the Christian life. They know the truth as well or better than most in the church, but their faith is in their knowledge and not in the Lord and His standard of faithful living. Everywhere I've ever lived, I've run across these brethren. Everywhere I've ever lived, whether it be Missouri, Tennessee, Arizona, Alabama, everywhere I've ever lived, I've known these brethren. They'd never tolerate error being taught on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. They'd never tolerate error being taught on the various aspects of worship. You know, instrumental music or the Lord's Supper or any other aspect of worship. They demand that strict adherence to the doctrine of Christ be taught. And yet, never in church on Sunday night, never in church on Wednesday night, find any excuse that they can find and not be in the services of the church. You know, and if they were to hear that somebody taught error on Sunday night, they'd lose their ever-loving minds, even though they wasn't there to hear it. Where's their faith? Their faith is in what they know. But what they do doesn't correspond with what they know. And that was the situation of the Jews. Their faith was in what they knew. But what they did was not consistent with the law that they purported to know. And like I said, and in the church, we can find ourselves no better than them in such cases. Does that make sense? All right, we'll stop right there for now and pick up in question 9 next week. Question 9 next week. Got my pen.